our presentation today. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to give a brief information about you in both languages, in Turkish and English. But I'm going to start with Turkish first, then repeat the same thing in English, and I'm going to leave the stage to you. Sevgili arkadaşlar, hoş geldiniz, günaydın. Bugün Mannheim'dan Profesör Dirk Eifenthal'la birlikteyiz. Kendisinin bizim davetimizi kabul etmesi ve bugün bizimle olması tabii ki bizleri çok memnun etti. Prezentasyonumuz yaklaşık 45 dakika sürecek. Dirk'le dün konuştuğumuzda eğer isterlerse sunu boyunca bana soru sorabilirler dedi. Onun için chat box kullanabilirsiniz sorularınız için. Kendisi gerekli gördüğünde sunu esnasında da cevap verebilecek size. Ya da bütün soruları presentation'ın sonunda toplu şekilde cevaplandıracak. Bu arada sevgili Muhittin'e çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Muhittin Şahin'e Ege Üniversitesi'nden. Çünkü sağ olsun Elma Lab'in bir üyesi olarak o da şu anda Profesör Eifenthaler ile birlikte çalışıyor Almanya'da ve bu webinarın gerçekleşmesi için çok çaba sarf etti. Kendisine de teşekkür ediyoruz. Dear attendees, now today we are hosting Professor Dirk Eifenthaler. And as you know, he's one of the leading names in the field of learning analytics. But of course, his interest is not limited to learning analysis, but also cognitive psychology, educational technology, and organizational learning. As you know, Dirk has several publications in terms of data analysis and learning analytics in education. And today we are planning to have a 45 minutes of presentation. And he's accepting questions through the chat box throughout the presentation. Please keep typing your questions. And also he's going to answer all questions at the end of the presentation. Dirk, thank you so much for accepting our invitation for this webinar. And I am sure that all attendees and myself, we are all so excited to listen to your presentation. And here you have the stage.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today and at your 11 in the morning and my 10 in the morning. So that's all great for us to collaborate and see what's happening in the space of learning analytics. And especially, I'm not only involved in learning analytics for a long time, but also I'm very critical in terms of learning analytics. What can they bring and what is really the benefit out of it? And what is new on it? So it's big questions we are asking. I think over the last 7 or 8 years in literature. But is there really some evidence already that learning analytics work? That's my question today for the webinar. So as you heard from the introduction, I'm a professor at the University of Mannheim in Germany. I'm also affiliated with the Curtin University in Australia, where we have a UNESCO chair for data science in higher education, learning and teaching, and that's also where I'm working and doing research in the space of course, data analytics, learning analytics, all this around making education better and the world a better learning place. So that's basically our goal, and I think most of you might share this passion as well. We have several projects in Germany, but also in Australia on learning analytics, and we are having a large network internationally. And so it would be great if you have also some projects which might line up with our projects, so we can link them together and build common understanding on learning analytics. And so I would be very much interested in the scene in Turkey and what's happening there, and how you evolve your universities or education systems using data for building evidence around learning and teaching. So let me start because we only have some limited time. When learning analytics started, they evolved as the increased opportunities to collect and make use of data. What does that mean? We had many different systems at our education institutions, like learning management systems or student management systems, customer relationship management systems, and all these systems were transferred into the electronic or digital space in the early 2000s. Some were quicker, some were slower, but in the early 2000s, the learning management systems came up. And since then, I'm also involved in this space of looking at learning management system data in the background, in the databases, and understand what's happening there. This is, for me, the starting point of Learning Lytics, where I started. So the first Moodle instances, for example, were a good basis for me to understand what students are doing or not doing in my learning management system. So I saw that many students didn't access Moodle at all, and what was the reason? And I was going back to my students and asking them, and they said, well, we cannot access it because we don't have internet at home, so we only can access it at a university, and then it's not much of our use. And so we evolved our understanding. So this was the first time of Learning Lytics, where we really looked at data which is available and tried to make sense out of this data. But now it's a different time. Now it's up to us as researchers and educators to define what data do we want to collect and use that data we define for making informed decisions on learning and teaching. So that's a different side. This is the flip side. On the one side, in the beginning, we had data available and we tried to make understanding out of it. And now we define what data we want in order to better understand and better support the learning. So that's the two directions of Learning Lytics. And this can be seen, I need to move forward here, sorry, in a plethora of publications at the moment. So we have, of course, our big term Learning Lytics, but in the meantime, if you go into literature, you find academic analytics, you find assessment analytics, or game-based and serious games analytics, retention, school, teacher analytics, measurement analytics. All these terms are popping up in literature. And there are studies on the measurement analytics, for example, or assessment analytics. But what does it really mean? Is it something new, or is it just repurposing the old statistics term? And in many cases, when I watch or read through studies, it's just applying statistics procedures, and they call it Learning Lytics. In the former times, you had a paper publishing understanding students' reading behavior. Now it's a learning analytics approach to reading. But the content and the originality is not really much new. It's still applied the same regression analysis, for example, but learning lytics are more than that. And that's a confusion in the field at the moment. So everybody tries to use this buzzword learning lytics to be published and to be, accepted in the field. But in the background, if you go and dig deeper in these papers, there might be no learning lytics at all. So what is it really, learning lytics, and what is it about? That's what I want to talk about today in the first sense. So what are learning lytics? How do learning lytics really impact practice if we understand learning lytics as a concept? And then how can they be adopted, of course, as well at the institution? So it's not easy because there are technical affordances to adopt learning lytics. There's staff affordances. People need to be, further educated in terms of learning lytics, but also there is, of course, the conceptual understanding of learning lytics, which needs to be better understood. So all these questions are currently popping up in literature as well, and it's very confusing sometimes, as I said before, what learning lytics are really. So from my perspective, learning lytics really started with this data driven approach, which means we had education data mining in the first sense. So we've been going into the databases and big data from education applications and try to understand what's happening in this data. It was very summative, it was very retrospective, because we've been looking in the education data mining field really into data sets which were available and which were basically finished after a semester or something like that. Then there was a term coming up as well, the academic analytics, which is basically all institutional decision making using data from different sources and making the educational system a better place, basically. So many higher education systems started this in the USA and in the UK, but also in Australia. These were the leading countries really understanding, okay, there is data sitting, we can use this and repurpose the data to better make actionable strategies. And in the last sense, it's the really core of Learning Lytics. It's really about measuring, collecting, and analyzing, and again, reporting data about learners and their context. So that's very important. We not only look at a learner as an individual behavior, but we also look at the context where this behavior really happens and try to understand why it's happening, and of course then optimizing the learning. So the learning needs to be in the foreground in learning analytics. That's what we call it, learning analytics, of course. So we try to analyze what's happening in learning, and of course also how can we support and optimize it. So I bring it a little bit further and would say we could also term it analytics for learning. So it's a different perspective. So it's not learning analytics because that's more passive. And analytics for learning is very active in my understanding. And that is nothing else than using static and dynamic information about the learners and their learning environments. Again, the learning environment is the context. So my understanding is here the static information, which is not changing over time very rapidly. And we have dynamic information, which is changing very quickly over time. So all your trace data you collect in the learning management system, for example, that's dynamic information. But it can be also slowly dynamic information, which means the knowledge gain you build up throughout the semester. So the competence you might evolve over time. So that's also dynamic, but it's very slowly dynamic. Dynamic can also be personal dispositions. Like today, I'm emotionally very positive and happy. Other days, I'm very negative and I'm bored because the content I don't like at all. And that's also dynamic. So it's fluctuating up and down in terms of my affective dispositions as a person, because we are not a machine. We are every day we are different. And all this information is, of course, influencing learning. And that's, in the best world, what we are collecting and what we are making sense of. So we try to assess it, we try to elicit it, which means we visualize all the learning through different modes, for example, a dashboard in a learning management system, or other modes, like providing a prompt, hey, you're doing great today, or things just supporting a person through a textual communication. And now it comes, it's very important that we do this in real time or near real-time modeling. What does that mean? Well, it's a matter of whenever you need something for learning, then you will receive it. So that means that we are constantly updating our database, and we are constantly updating our analysis results in order to best fit the learner's needs. And of course, we can also predict things happening in the future. So that would be a possibility. But the most important aspect is, of course, supporting learning processes whenever they are needed. So it can be that today I'm very confident and I don't need very much support. So I can say, well, today, leave me alone. I'm okay learning on myself. And at the end of the day, I might take a self-assessment and get a positive response. Yes, I was learning very well. And another day, I might be very bored and saying, well, today I need lots of support. So I'm saying to the system, in the best word again, hey, give me as much support as possible, otherwise I cannot learn anything today. So that would be the dynamic response of the system towards the needs of the person. And so you see, the interaction is very complicated between the human and the machine. So all these human machine and human computer interactions need to fit very well. And from the one side, we can adapt the system to the learner, but on the other side, the learner can personalize towards the system. And that's the two ways Learning Lytics really work very well together. So if I can decide as a learner what I want, and on the other side, the system knows exactly what I could need at the moment. And all this together is basically analytics for learning, which is a very active way of supporting the learning. But what you see at this definition only is that we need lots of data and lots of different data points, different types of data and quality of data. And if we miss something, we of course cannot receive that.
Excuse me for cutting off, but on our screens, the presentation is not moving. Probably it's moving on your screen.
Yes.
Still stuck with the cover page of your presentation? Just
Oh, you
remind.
can't see it?
No,
Okay.
it's not moving on our screen. And the other issue is that did you start recording, Dirk? I just
Yeah, I started the recording, yes, of course, but there's...
But I have no idea why the presentation is not moving. I am working on that. But can you see another menu that I cannot see because we are hosting this that helps moving the presentation on the screen of everybody?
I can, so I'm just looking at this at the moment, and can you see it now?
No, we are still stuck on the first page, the cover page.
Okay, I'm already on page 6.
Oh God, you moved a lot. I have no idea why this is happening. I am not that good at with this application. This is new to me. But maybe Muhittin, can you check if there is anything that you can do about this?
I am not the host now, so I can't do anything for now. But
You don't have the privilege.
yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to work on this. I'm going to search on the internet what might be the problem. If I can come up with a solution, I'll share that with you guys. Okay? Why don't you start, Dirk?
Okay, so that's I'm very sorry about this, but
Okay, we can maybe fix this.
okay, so I just maybe continue and hopefully we can fix it. So I'm on page 7 now. I can also share the slides later on, and maybe you can follow up on the slides, rewatching the video. So if we have this issue of Learning Lytics, we might look at from an organizational perspective. We can address. Oh, now it's something new moving. Can you see it now? My whole slides are moving now, but
now it's moving, Dirk. Now we can see a different slide. Analytics for learning use static and dynamic.
Okay. Can you see it now? The next slide.
Perfect.
So this is now where I am, slide 7. And so we're looking from an organizational perspective on Learning Lytics. So we can address, of course, the micro layer, which is the learning environment and the learner's interaction with the learning environment and the learning artifacts like videos and slides and things like that, and reading materials, assessments. But we also can have Learning Lytics as a perspective on the meso level, which is we can increase the curriculum's quality, make the curriculum more consistent in terms of the requirements we might have as learning outcomes, and align the assessments in a better way, but also have the teacher and the tutor to better fit to the needs of the learning environment, which means also the learners, so they can receive information how to better, support the students. And on the macro level, on the institutional decision making, we might also do some Learning Lytics, of course, helping to allocate resources and helping the whole institution to better fit towards the needs of the society in terms of what is the future workplace and how can we build new study programs, which is then, of course, the mega level, the governance, political decision making. So Learning Lytics can, and all the data we collect and the analysis we do can help on all these different levels on the organizational perspective. So, and given that scenario, we can use Learning Lytics for different benefits, and that's what slide 8 is now showing here. We have the different stakeholders, like the student, the teacher, the learning design, the organization, and the governance. And we have different perspectives of Learning Lytics. So a summative perspective, which is after something is, of course, done within a semester's time, for example. We have the real-time perspective, formative, the feedback, for example, and we have some predictive, what is looking into the future and prescribing what should happen to achieve a specific state. And all these cells within this matrix can be filled with benefits. And I included some examples of benefits, and you can see there's so many benefits here. An institution cannot use all these cells to go into Learning Lytics and make it happen. So you have to be wise to choose what is your first perspective if you start with Learning Lytics. Maybe as a student support system and you do summative in real time. So already you have lots of benefits for the students, but you're not overwhelmed with all and everything. And then step by step, you can include more cells. And of course, the goal would be to have a very general Learning Lytics system and building all the benefits, of course. So this is a good starting point for me when you think about Learning Lytics and what you want to do. Otherwise, people get overwhelmed and say, okay, we really do not know what to do, and this is a good starting point here. But I have two problems with Learning Lytics. Said all this before. The first problem is there's a lack of rigorous empirical research findings demonstrating that there's an effectiveness of Learning Lytics to support study success. So really, we want to have Learning Lytics or Analytics for Learning making learning better, and of course the institution a better place for learning, but we have no real rigorous empirical research finding that this is really working. And on the other side, there's no large-scale organizational implementation of Learning Lytics. So there's no institutional bodies really having Learning Lytics in a statewide implementation phase. Even there's no institution really having all the benefits of Learning Lytics covered yet. So there's only small and islands of Learning Lytics in institutions, but we have no wide-scale implementation. So that's my two arguments for today's remaining webinar. So going to the first one, no evidence. So we have lots of evidence like this. This is coming from a publication which just uses data, access data. It's event-based data, and I'm jumping back and forth. And this event-based data is kind of well, giving us information how students access throughout the semester, for example, and interact with different artifacts. But it's not really useful for the students' learning. It's in a retrospective way quite helpful. Also, we have data like this. We know what indicators might support pass and fail rates. We have here an example of an empirical study with over 1 million enrollments of students over several universities, identifying what are the best models to predict students' pass and fail rates, and which indicators really help us to understand students' pass and fail rates. Well, that's obvious that this is coming from historic data. We collected data, and that's basically what we have on evidence, which is okay in terms of understanding what's happening in larger settings of education environments, but it's not really the Learning Lytics I've been explaining before, like supporting learning in real time. This doesn't really help us very much in that sense. There's other meta studies like this one from a group from UK. They've been reviewing international practice, and as you can see, there's lots of islands in terms of studies, and the North American studies, this is slide 12 now. The North American studies are looking at student dropout, for example, very much. Then we have in the UK student retention and quality applications, and we have some studies conducted in Australia, but that's basically the three major countries where Learning Lytics are on the forefront still in research publications. If you move on, I'm going to show you here some work we've done in the last 2 years, supported by the German Research Foundation. And this is where we collected over 6,000 studies on Learning Lytics and try to understand. Oh, my slides are jumping back again. I'm sorry, this technical issue is continuing. But again, slide 13. So we've been asking it's again going back. Oh no, sorry. So the 3 research questions. What study success measures have been operationalized in Learning Lytics? What factors from Learning Lytics system contribute towards study success? And other specific interventions coming out of Learning Lytics. So we've been looking at over 6,000 studies in the beginning, and then of course did a rigorous selection process on the quality of studies. And in the end, we found 46 key studies really having empirical rigor, but also having the information provided we wanted to have in terms of understanding what Learning Lytics are and how they support study success. Just quickly on the results here. So this is the first part of this results table. of these 46 studies. And as you can see here, of course, the authors, when the studies were published, and the countries they were coming from. But what is very important is the sample size. As you can see here, there's a very high variation of sample size, and 29 students, for example, involved in the sample of the first study, or 24,000 students involved in the third study. So this high variation of sample size also indicates this problem that Learning Lytics are not implemented in a larger setting in most cases. So most studies come from small-scale studies, and these studies are like in one course only conducted for one specific group of students. So we don't have this empirical evidence we want to have, which is generalizable for all education institutions. So very limited here. Also, what we see is that many variables are not operationalized and not collected in that rigorous way we want to see in empirical studies. So, for example, the study success measure is often not mentioned as a dependent variable, and also there's problems around the operationalization of this variable and a valid assessment of these variables. And again, we also wanted to have a look at interventions, and these interventions are in many cases also not available. So we came to a conclusion that the research rigor of these studies, still, these were the 46 strongest studies we found in Learning Lytics over the past 7 years, were still weak and moderate. We didn't find any strong research study in the field currently conducted. And that's a big problem in the space of Learning Lytics at the moment. We need better studies here. Still, we came up with some recommendations. So we need more educational leadership. We need to sustain models of educational leadership to embrace the nature of Learning Lytics and to make, of course, the research better around Learning Lytics as well. So we need people from computer science and data science. We need people from psychology and cognitive science, but also from education, to work together to make these studies more rigorous and better working and identifying us with better outcomes. We need to care for idiosyncrasies, which means what are the data telling us we are collecting in these different studies, because different sizes of student groups and courses, different domains, the data is collected, different cultures of study, cultural background of students, but also of institutions. That's all problems we have in the data set. So what can we bring together and what needs to be divided in terms of the analysis is a very big question, unsolved yet. Also the question of assessment, of course, what are best practices of assessment in a formative way, in a summative way, and what are we can use for better understand Learning Lytics. Then also questions around the organizational structure, how are Learning Lytics embedded in the organization where it's happening, where the data collection is happening and where the learning is happening, of course, and how is this, of course, also supported. Quality assurance is a problem, not only the quality of the curriculum and of the learning environments and the materials, but also of the data in itself. So how robust is the data we are using, and what analytical tools are really helpful to better, provide us with data we can use for multiple purposes. For example, also what do we make with missing data and how do we handle this? Can we still support a student? We have missing data for the last three weeks question, or do we need to exclude this student? And what happens then to the student if the student is excluded from Learning Lytics? Big questions from an ethical point of view, but also questions from data protection. What happens if a student does not want to provide the data because of privacy reasons? I'm saying no, you don't get any data about my learning because that's my own data and I don't give it to you. Given the benefits of it, I might think of providing my data to somebody, but that's also a big case. So ethics and privacy around data and data protection is a very big issue. That's well researched at the moment, but still a problem. So we are currently on slide 15 and moving on to slide 16. The question here is, and again, my slides are jumping back and forth, Again, on slide 16, we have cross-institutional recommendations. We want to enable institutional and cross-institutional exchange, also at government level. We support the implementation of national boards, not only for learning lytics, but also for ethical and privacy reasons. So there comes in all the data protection aspects as well. We might build some framework solutions for providing learning lytics to different institutions, but that also requires, of course, a nationwide understanding and current leadership in learning lytics, and also, of course, rigorous research. And we want to support, of course, also collaboration amongst researchers, and not only researchers, but also industry partners from commercial sides to better integrate solutions of learning lytics. So these are things coming out of these studies we've been reviewing, and at the end, the 46 studies gave us all these recommendations we've been collecting here. I move on to my second argument, which is there's no wide-scale organizational implementation of learning lytics in today's educational systems. Slide 18. So we have challenges for establishing learning lytics systems, and very much is the problem at a single institution, the interaction and fragmentation of information we have, but also the contextual idiosyncrasies. So the interaction and fragmentation on the one side is how do a student support system and a learning management system interact with each other. So that's data frameworks we have to build. We have to have different databases which are connected, and also student identifiers which can be securely shared through the systems, etc. If you look at the landscape, there's not many institutions which are technically advanced like this. There are, of course, but we still have institutions, they don't have these capabilities. Then we have fragmentation of data, which means that there is no existing data on the student management system, but lots of data in the learning management system. So what do we do with that if we have a very robust algorithm, but also requiring student management data we don't have, or we don't have real-time data at the moment. So how can we resolve this fragmentation of data? And then, of course, the contextual issues we have around data. So where is it collected from in terms of the context of the domain? In engineering, there will be a different learning approach than in medicine and in social sciences. And there's different methodologies used in studies, different learning strategies, etc., etc. And all these idiosyncrasies are somewhat hidden in the data, but not in a direct layer of data. So we have to find all these patterns and make sense out of these patterns. Again, this is a problem. And if we have a fragmentation of data, we cannot really follow up with these contextual idiosyncrasies. So big problem here as well. So moving on, slide 19. We've been trying to understand this also from a qualitative research approach perspective, and we've been interviewing in one other study over 150 international organizations, and here it's another study we've conducted with about 40 leaders of universities and trying to understand what are they doing at the moment. And 34 participants agreed and emphasized that there's a first large obstacle to learning lytics, the data protection issue. So they don't know what is the current data protection laws, and how can we cope with that on the university level, and how do we have to inform all the stakeholders, the students, the teachers, the administrators. So big problems around data collection and how to administer and, of course, use the data for specific purposes. So, and if they are, of course, left alone with their questions, they will never be able to implement learning lytics. So that's a big hurdle from administrative point of view, but also from point of view of understanding learning lytics in general. Slide 20 shows the readiness to adopt learning lytics. And 30 participants mentioned that there were not any learning lytics projects currently operating at their institution, which is exactly going back to the first argument here. They have fear to do something wrong or violate the law around data protection, and that's why they don't embrace the learning lytics. even if they know that there's lots of benefits for study success. But on the other side, they might also be shy to invest money into Learning Lytics because they don't see that there's any empirical research really showing and showcasing that Learning Lytics can be beneficial for learning. So again, you see there's big problems around the adoption. If I don't adopt because I don't have evidence for it, and we cannot build evidence because there's no adoption of it. So that's our big problem, right? Moving on to the slide 21, implementation guidelines. Many institutions also miss implementation guidelines. Big challenges of education communities not supporting each other. Lack of professional learning, like I said before, the stakeholders are not ready because they don't have the knowledge about it, and also policy standards are not existing, like General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, for example. That's basically stopping everybody from doing something with data, but it's stopping them because they don't understand it. It's not because the law is too strict. It's the people are not ready to use it and fully play on it. So what we need is more the experimental playgrounds. That's an argument, and that's what many people do, and that's what we also reflected in the studies. So because that's why we have the small-scale studies. That's why we have only islands of Learning Lytics implemented, because the institutions cannot move forward because they are not ready for it. They don't have the guidelines. They don't have the regulations in place to make it a larger investment for an institution. So big issues here we identified in our research. So what can we do? We need to do some change management in Learning Lytics for the institution, and that's going back to workshops we are doing from my research group. So we do a readiness assessment based on a benefits matrix I've been explaining before, where we look at what do they have at the institution and what do they want, basically. And then we identify the organizational readiness, the technical readiness, and the staff readiness for Learning Lytics and for what they want to achieve as a benefit from Learning Lytics. And based on all this information on procedures, policies, on the data warehouse they have, on data management and the learning analytics and design people, we create an implementation strategy for them, which can span, of course, over several years. And step by step, then they can follow up, and in an iterative design process, they can start implementing Learning Lytics at their institution and build benefits around it and gain something for their students or for their teachers, etc., etc. But without a change management like this, it will not work at all. So we need to address all this, otherwise you will clearly fail, that's for sure. So there's different organizational perspectives which are laid out here on 23 slide. Architecturing for Learning Lytics, some colleagues from Australia here published an EDICORS review, so that this can be centralized on the one side. It can be also coming from a presidential order, but also it can come up from bottom up, like a research lab is starting it and then building it throughout the organization-wide implementation. So different approaches, and it needs to fit, of course, to the universities or to the education institutions' needs. So yeah, there's different models on how to uptake also and buy in the stakeholders. Another study here referenced on slide 24, how to build strategy and capabilities around Learning Lytics on different levels, like having the tools and the research around it as well. So I think it's clear that from my perspective, it's always evidence-centered design approaches, which research informs the implementation process as well. So every implementation will also have a research study included and building further on the research findings. So I come to some guidelines we created out of all this research we've conducted over the last few years. We need some flexible Learning Lytics systems which can cater for the needs of a single institution, but also larger institutions and consortiums. We require well, information about data and algorithms for Learning Lytics systems, and they need to be defined based on the benefits. And we need to involve all the higher education institution stakeholders, otherwise you cannot get any buy-in for Learning Lytics. The question of all the structures and processes need to be in place. We need to think, of course, on regulations about ethics and data privacy. There needs to be a quality assurance process. In my understanding, something like an accreditation for the algorithm and for the analysis in Learning Lytics, and of course also the question on data collection, data storage, and all this needs to be quality assured. And then we need lots of research funded in the individual countries, but also cross-country research being conducted so that everybody can start off. There might be also institutional funds, like single institutions can fund some initial projects on Learning Lytics to implement some aspects. And of course, also we need some more committees and stakeholders coming together from different groups like science, economy, and politics to really better understand and build some accreditation systems around Learning Lytics. So that's some guidelines we want to further stress out here. So let me come to a conclusion of this presentation. First of all, we need to have a high quality implementation, otherwise Learning Lytics do not work. That's on slide 27 at the moment. It's jumping back and forth again. What we can do is, like in the study here outlined on 28, build priorities on organizational cost, on technological cost, on the learning outcomes expected, and then on the willingness to adopt it as from a stakeholder perspective. And based on this, you can build a priority of implementation. Here, for example, for a student dashboard, reminder deadlines, low organizational cost and low technological cost, and high effectiveness for learning, and also the willingness to accept it. And that builds up to a high priority, and build on this, you can start, implementing from a Learning Lytics perspective. What would you implement and what not, like the term scheduler, which is not so effective and not really needed. So we don't go into the implementation process here. So that's also, again, the readiness assessment we could follow up here. The second one would be, in order to make Learning Lytics really work, we need something like a visualization, like a dashboard here, for example. On slide 29, dashboards need to be informative as well. So informative in that sense that they not only show graphs, which students cannot act on, they need to be informative so students know exactly using visual signals, but also recommendations and other things to help them really master their learning. So that's very important. Like a dashboard example here, we implemented a few years ago in order to also help the student to personalize their environment, build their own goals within the environment. That's something students are missing very much, because in most cases in dashboards, well, they just visualize some trends and graphs, and that's not very helpful for learning for the students. Also on slide 31, something like this. This is a prompt being provided to a student when the student touches something in the learning environment. For example, there pops up some reactive test, and the student can respond to it, and we have more data collection points in a dynamic way. So that's a trick also how to cope with missing data, for example. So that's also what we do, and which provided lots of positive insights. Page or slide 32. This is a example for a student, for a teacher dashboard. So here the teacher can see what students already did and how difficult they find it, and what research feedback they receive or need to receive throughout the lectures, for example. So also the teacher can get information about the students in a better way, and adopt the teaching to the students' needs, because every cohort of students is different, of course. We need to care for data protection, as I said before. I think clearly in the EU, but also in other countries, we have data protection laws, and we need to follow up with these data protection laws in a rigorous way and respect the students. Otherwise, as you can see here on page 34, the students will not provide their data. So if there is transparency around data, the concern over privacy will minimize. if there's no transparency and the students do not know what happens with their data and who has access to the data, the concern over privacy will maximize, and then the student will decide not to share data. So that's clearly laid out here in a study we published a few years ago, and that's still relevant, and we need to care for data protection very much, otherwise we don't get buy-in for Learning Lytics. Acceptance throughout the whole institution, like in the change management process I explained before, page 35 here, we can follow, for example, the delegate list in order to understand the acceptance of Learning Lytics and better support the students. Also, maybe as a very general perspective on Learning Lytics, we need to have education data literacy, which is nothing else than ethically responsible collection, management, analysis, comprehension, interpretation, and application of data from educational context, which means if you do not have education data literacy as a competence as a teacher, for example, you cannot really act on Learning Lytics recommendations. So it's important to understand where is the data coming from, what does it mean to use the data for all the stakeholders involved, and how can I interpret the data I'm using at the moment, and what is it best to read out of the data. So yeah, and this is like a competence framework we built around the data literacy. There's a EU Erasmus Plus project currently being conducted, and you might follow up with that project on the website as well. So let me finish with this slide. You can go and look and search through my publications on my website, but also you might be interested in publishing yourself in the space of Learning Lytics. Then we have a book series just published the first book in the book series, Advances in Analytics for Learning and Teaching. And if you're interested, just contact me and we can work on a proposal so you can publish your own books. I can envision a book about, you know, the scene of Learning Lytics in Turkey at the moment. So that would be a wonderful book, having several publications out of Turkey and your interest in research. I would like to see that in our book series, for example. If you have individual articles, you can publish that also in my journal, Technology, Knowledge and Learning. So you're invited to contact me whenever you have any questions here. And I think I'm just right on time. Sorry for the technical hiccups. I hope you got some little insights, but yeah, if there's anything, I follow up on our discussion now. Thank you.
Jörg, thank you so much for this informative presentation. Honestly, I couldn't feel like how the time was flying throughout your presentation, but it seems like we share the same concerns regarding to learning analytics, because there is too much to be done before learning analytics can become a real promise for education to improve learning. And now I want to give the stage to participants, attendees, to raise their questions. In the chat box, I don't see any questions so far. Maybe they might be direct their questions to you in person, but I don't see in the general chat box. Guys, you can either turn on your voice microphone, we can do it for you, and you can ask your questions, or you can type in the chat box and start discussing with Dirk, because his points are really important in the field of learning analytics.
I see one question is the national standardized summative tests starting in primary school, and of course also collecting lots of data and evidence around the learning of the students in those school-based systems. And then is there anything similar in Germany? No, it's not. We don't have anything similar in Germany. There's something similar being started in Switzerland at the moment, where they also try to understand, you know, having a learning ID throughout the lifetime, and basically following up with the learning progression over time. There's also no evidence around this. Is it really effective? Is it helpful? And standardized testing is, of course, a very specific test, and it doesn't really maybe reflect the competence of a student, and also not their they're developed from a psychological point of view, their development over time, the cognitive development in primary school is still very much evolving. So you cannot or might not be able to predict what happens in later stages of the learning. And there's so many different influences. You cannot collect all the data around the influences how students might end up in the end. But in a short-term perspective, I'm also a strong believer that evidence around learning in a school-based system can also support the teacher, how to better react and individualize the learning for the student and support the student to be a better learner. I think that's still also valid in primary school. It can also follow up in secondary school and of course higher education, where we have more self-regulated learning. We still can support learning through data like adaptive systems and personalizing it to the needs of the learner. So yes, it's a good starting point, collecting primary school data, but there's of course also limitations. There's another question I've been seeing. Teachers may feel that the data collected can be used for the evaluation of their courses and their performance. There's big concerns. That's true of teachers and faculty at higher education institutions, that data can be misused for other purposes. And that's what I'm referring to regulations. So everybody needs to understand what data is used for and what the data can be saying about different stakeholders. And if you collect fragments of data of course interactions, it might not reflect the teacher's competence at all. But some institutions might think of that, and that's of course a misconception within the institutional leaders, and we need to inform them that it's not the right way to misuse data for other purposes. And so that's very important. And if there's concerns, that's why we need something like a body accreditation of Learning Lytics as well. So that might be very helpful and needed. Otherwise, there can be, of course, this misuse of data also on the teacher side, and then, of course, there will be a resistance against using Learning Lytics at all. And I fully understand this argument.
Okay.
Another question here on the data. We need a lot of data for Learning Lytics. Maybe not a lot of data, but it really depends what Learning Lytics benefit should be. So there can be also small data sets informing, the learning process. But in general, it can be, of course, also very wide and perspectives on data collected. So from, as I said, effective behavior, but also from prior academic performance. We know from meta studies that the prior knowledge is, of course, the driver for all academic success. And that's, of course, important information we can use in all Learning Lytics approaches as well. As I said before, we have, of course, our books series where you can support. We are just working on a new book focusing on visualizations. There should be a call for chapters coming out soon. I expect that in June or July there will be a new call. Check my website frequently, and you will see the call as well. And you can also propose yourself a special issue for my journal, for example. Also an interesting question on alternative of data economy. So small data, what I explained before, is also something. I'm a strong believer in having like data economy and not building on big data sets and using lots of patterns, but also having the real-time perspective. And so you don't need to have the tons and piles of data. Maybe you aggregate something which is a valid indicator for your prior learning history, but you don't need all these tons of data around. And so it's really a matter of finding the right data strategy. It's not an easy question to answer in a minute, but there's lots of different approaches to data economy, and thinking about data economy in our data-rich societies is very wise to do at the moment. Artificial intelligence. Well, the question is, what is artificial intelligence? The algorithms we are using in Learning Lytics are, of course, artificial intelligence. And the risk is, again, the misuse of data we have within that space. Are the algorithms really working in that way? We expect them to work. Are they valid for different situations? Or that's of course also a big risk. And if the algorithms are evolving over time because they are learning themselves and advance themselves, that can be, of course, a risk if there is no external control on the evolving of the algorithm. So that might be also something which needs to be expected here. Oh, that's an interesting question also. The problem of operationalizing and having the rigorous evidence around Learning Lytics, is it the problem because there's a quality of teaching and learning in reality quite low, and that's why we don't have, so that might be a point which is very important as well. So if there is, of course, no high quality teaching and learning in the institution happening, then there might be also difficulty in operationalizing aspects for Learning Lytics. So, for example, we have a free tier system in Learning Lytics. We have the student data, we have the learning data, and we have the curriculum data. And if the curriculum data is not operationalized, like having learning outcomes and materials linked to the learning outcomes, if there's no clear structure, we cannot build references around learning and the progression of learning. So that's, in my understanding, also reflecting the weak quality of the teaching and the curriculum, if this is not in place. So, and then we also might find lack and problems of operationalizing learning for Learning Lytics. Yeah, so it links together, of course. So again, the change management in the institution is also a change management for the whole learning culture of the institution. There's lots of machine learning or data sets available, for example, from edX, like the MOOC provider. They have data sets made available, and you can use these data sets from larger courses to test your machine learning algorithms. So I highly recommend this always to my students. If they want to, test algorithms they're developing, they might go there and use larger data sets and get aspects in here. Standardization for exchanging learning data. Yes, we have, of course, standards. All and everything around XAPI, for example. So that's standards developed, but not everybody is adhering to these standards and using the standards. So that's something which is also problematic. There's new standards being developed over and over again, but there's no governing body on Learning Lytics really promoting the standards. So everybody is working on their own data exchange patterns, and so we are quite far away from standardizing this like in medicine. Yeah, I think I covered most of the questions so far.
Yep, it seems like you covered all the questions. Is there any other questions, dear attendees, that you would like to send before Dirk is gone? I don't see any questions, Dirk, in the chat box. But this is a new application for most of the attendees. WebEx, probably they are having this technical trouble. There is now one came from Sajib. make a connection with learning management system metrics and learning theory.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I like this. So the learning lytics field is not really much informed from learning theories or learning sciences at the moment. So we need a stronger impotence on learning science constructs we know from research over the last 50 or 100 years even. Really guiding learning lytics research through learning sciences perspectives and not the other way around, saying, okay, this is the data and now we do something and then we see what or how could we relate this to learning. So the other way would be the better way, of course, to say, okay, we know about learning processes and cognitive changes over time. We know about reasoning processes and problem-solving processes. What are indicators and variables identifying these steps of learning, these iterative processes in our cognitive systems, and what data do we need to better support these processes? And then we go into the system again and say, okay, we need to collect different data sets at different time points to better inform then our analysis and our feedback system. So that would be the approach, of course, which is not the data-driven approach, but the demand-driven approach I've been referring to in my first slides in my presentation. Absolutely correct.
There might be one more question, Dirk. Now I'm trying to dig out that question because attendee says he sent a question to you as a host and to all participants, but it didn't show up in the chat box. So I asked him to send his question to me in person. So I'm going to read that question to you. And I'm expecting for the question to be asked. Is it coming? Okay, let me see if we are going to be able to manage to handle that question. Probably it's going to be the last question to be answered. Okay, now here comes the question. The attendee says you said that there was no strong evidence on the effectiveness of learning analytics. He thinks the problem relates to learning analytics is related to educational feedback design rather than information is provides, what the information provides. What do you think about this?
Yeah.
Design?
Fully understand and fully support this argument. So the learning lytics systems are very passive systems we have at the moment. So they are not really like, again, this is going back to the other argument, like the learning sciences, what we know about feedback, what we know about assessment. This is not part of learning lytics at the moment in a strong way. So the passive systems like a dashboard, visualizing just, some graphs, this is not really helpful feedback that the learner can act on. And that's what we know from feedback design, for example, from scaffolding, how scaffolds need to be built up and, fading away in different learning phases again, and how they work emotionally and how they work on a motivational scale as well. We know lots of studies about this, but it's not implemented in learning lytics at the moment. So what we only see is, in most cases, dashboards visualizing graphs, and that's, of course, very passive. Students cannot act on it, so we need to have more, as you said in your questions, more implications from feedback design, how to better feedback out of an electronic system to be accepted as a learner, the feedback, and to act on that feedback as well. So that's what we are missing, and that's why we also don't have any large effects coming out of the learning lytics systems in the studies we can regard as qualitative good study. So very problematic. So as I said before, we're going to work on a new book looking at dashboards and visualizations. And whenever the call is coming up, you're all invited to participate in this book as well, because that might exactly include something around feedback design and assessment design, how to better support students through dashboards using a better design approach. And coming from the learning sciences and the feedback and assessment direction, this would be a very much beneficial contribution. And if you have something in mind, then propose your chapters.
Perfect. But this is my understanding from your answer is that especially those young scholars who are interested in learning analytics field, they should include into their research agenda that we should link learning analytics with feedback design and learning. So we can make a use of this in the daily practice. So it's going to be a new field for those young scholars to start searching on. Perfect, perfect, Dirk. Any other questions, dear attendees? I don't see any in the chat box, but let me check. No, there is no. Okay. So, Dirk, I'm going to close the session, and I'm going to thank to you again. It was a delightful and very informing presentation. I hope we can make another webinar on an interesting topic that probably young scholars are going to be attending. And we would like to also see you in flesh when this nationwide lockdown is over. I hope we can make it to visit you in Germany, or you can make it to visit us in Turkey. And we wish you a very good day, dear Dirk, and stay home, stay safe.
Thank you very much to everybody attending today, and I will stop the recording now and hope
to see
you soon. Right. Thanks. Bye-bye.